Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Christy and Maria. I was just thinking that I am so fortunate to live in Ithaca and get to work with you and work with my beautiful colleagues. I just miss you all so much. So many of you know that I teach music history at Ithaca College, but I also do a lot of thinking about how learning works. And so I'm going to share with you a story or a little metaphor that I share with all my students at the beginning of every class. You ready? So it's about how learning really works. So K through 12, this is my improvised whiteboard. You like this? K through 12 education treats learners like buckets often, and that it's the teacher's job to put chunks of knowledge into their buckets. And we can measure how full the buckets get at certain points with standardized tests, or we can celebrate certain achievements with like eighth grade graduation or high school graduation. But this is basically the model. There are a lot of assumptions with this model. One is that the buckets are all the same, they're all still, that they hold material at the same rates. And really, it's the teacher's job. It's the teacher that's the one that's active in this model. But that's not really how transformational education works. So I want to suggest that instead of a bucket, the learner is more like an ice cube. We come to a certain situation in a fairly unsophisticated shape like a cube, and that the educational moment is like the ice cube leaning into a heat source like the candle. And what happens in that moment is that part of the candle will start to melt. And that melting is a moment where we kind of rethink who we are, or we're really challenged by certain assumptions that we hold. And it's a challenging moment. It's a confrontational moment. And so the reaction is to actually back up, to back off of the heat source. And as we do that, this social psychologist called this process refreezing. So as we refreeze, we don't refreeze back into the old cube shape, but we refreeze into a new, more sophisticated shape. This is as we gain new skills, we think differently, we have different assumptions about who we are and how the world works. And this transformational model has also a bunch of assumptions, right? That the student is the one that's driving the educational experience. This involves lots of ambiguity. Also, I don't want to suggest that this is the teacher, the heat source is the teacher. The heat source is the educational experience. And the teacher's also working with the student in this kind of transformational way. One of the lovely assumptions about that is that we're all unique, that we have different outcomes on the other side of this educational experience, but it involves lots and lots of ambiguity. We don't know who we're going to be on the other side of this experience. And I bet Dawn and her students could speak to this by the pain of the transformational experience when these very, very talented students show up to Ithaca College to work with her. She's so excited to have them. And then she says, all right, I'm so glad you're here, but we need to work on this tension that you're holding in your voice, or what other bad habit they have. And the students have to trust her and that process to really change how they're singing. But they don't know how they're going to sing on the other side of that transformational experience. So this ambiguity of melting and refreezing that's so uncomfortable, maybe even painful, it's painful precisely because the not knowing. And that's the hardest thing about our current moment right now, right? The not knowing. What's going to happen to school in the fall? Will students and teachers be able to return to their classrooms? Will Ithaca be able to welcome its college students back? Will there be an economy to return to after this? Is my job safe? Or maybe you've already lost your job and you don't know what you're going to do next. There are so many unknowns. We are in a storm of ambiguity, of melting, to use my metaphor, and we haven't really yet started to refreeze into the something new that's going to happen after the pandemic. So this process of melting and refreezing has a lot in common with the spiritual notion of the dark night of the soul. I started reading about the dark night of the soul at the beginning of our, what I'm going to call quarantine, when it was still Lent. And actually, I feel like it is still Lent now, right? It's a time of fasting. We're fasting our social experiences. I don't know how familiar you are with the idea of the dark night of the soul, but it's often described as a period in a believer's life where they feel utter spiritual desolation, disconnection, emptiness, and a total separation from the divine. The 16th century mystics Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross wrote extensively on the dark night of the soul. And to me, utter spiritual desolation, disconnection, emptiness, separation from the divine, that frankly sounds like the worst thing possible. But Teresa and John saw the dark night as a season for tremendous growth, indeed, even necessary for spiritual maturity. St. John of the Cross said that the dark night of the soul is not dark because it's evil, but because it's obscure, oscura in Spanish, right? It's dark because we can't see where we're going. It reminds me of the passage that Rebecca preached on last week, right? The disciples on the road to Emmaus speaking with Jesus, but they don't recognize him until their eyes were opened. Or Mary at the tomb weeping, comforted by a man that she later recognizes as Jesus. Or when Jesus meets the 7 disciples fishing and makes breakfast for them on the shore, they don't recognize him. In fact, Jesus is pretty consistently not recognized by the closest to him after the resurrection. One could argue that in all of those scenes, they are taking place in low light conditions, right? In the tomb at dusk or at dawn. And honestly, I don't know why people don't recognize Jesus after the resurrection, but I suspect that it speaks to the condition of the dark night, a season of sight and clarity obscured. And we are in such a moment. We can't see clearly what's going to happen next. And we really struggle against the weight of the unknowns. It's what Rebecca was saying earlier, with the anxiety that accompanies ambiguity. So I want this morning to suggest that instead of holding on tightly to the unknowns, that we hold tightly to what we know. And we have 3 knowns that we can count on during this difficult time. It is Shepherd Sunday. That's why all the lectionary readings refer to sheep or a shepherd. And so I'm going to use the metaphor of the shepherd and the sheep. So among the unknowns, we have 3 knowns that I'm going to suggest this morning. First, that we have a good shepherd that protects us. Second, that we are meant to live as a flock. And third, that our shepherd has proven his trustworthiness. So first, we have a good shepherd that protects us. When I saw the lectionary readings for this week, I have to admit that I was a bit disappointed that the psalm was Psalm 23. It's certainly the best known of the Psalms, and I have a little trouble with the saccharine depictions of Jesus as a beatific blonde shepherd that often accompany this psalm. And really, it's repeated too often for my taste in the lectionary. We just heard it on the 4th Sunday of Lent, March 22nd. But ironically, I keep coming back to the psalm when I preach. Last time I preached, I spoke about communion, and I mentioned that this psalm depicts a communion feast. The Good Shepherd prepares a table for me in the presence of my enemies. And despite my poor attitude about this psalm this week, I found something new and fresh. This week I was struck by the line, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." In the past, I've heard this as, "Even when I am in times of physical danger, you are with me." But this week I read it as, "Even during the dark night of the soul, when I can't feel your presence, you are with me." St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila say that when we lose a sense of the presence of God during the dark night of the soul, that we haven't lost the divine, but rather we've lost our conception of the divine. In other words, our small manufactured notion of who God is. The dark night is often triggered by the death of our hopes and dreams when we realize that they were not God's will for us, that they were not also God's hopes and dreams. The loss of my notion of God is an important one on the spiritual journey. With that loss, I can begin to realize that God is not who I imagined, but more. He is fully unimaginable, more than my feeble human mind can take in. And He is with me even as my notions of Him come and go. The second thing that I can count on is that we are meant to live as a flock. I think that's one thing that's become really clear during this time of social isolation. The passage from Acts that Crystal and Matt read is the only lectionary that for this week, the reading, that doesn't mention sheep explicitly, but it does describe a flock. I'm going to read just a little bit of it to remind us. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. Every time I've read this passage in the past, it sounded like such a utopia to live in a community that shares everything, breaks bread together with glad and generous hearts, spends time in praise and worship. And to be honest, to this girl who grew up close to the hippie capital of Boulder, Colorado, it sounds pretty appealing. But as I studied for this week, I learned that this community described in Acts was not. It was created as a direct result of the Pentecost. They were not the utopia that we think, but they were living in a very precarious situation. It's not the obviously idyllic sandal-clad, flowers in the hair, peace-knit group that I'd like to think. Those who joined the community did so at their peril, leaving behind everything that was familiar and the family systems that had kept them safe up to that point. These early Jesus groups were persecuted, and yet they were still joyful and grateful. They were in it together. So this reminds me of the hashtag right now, in this together, right? One of my clever social media friends posted something like, "We thought the apocalypse would bring zombies and tribal warfare, but instead it has brought incredible creativity, collaboration, generosity, and socially validated day drinking." So people are working together separately to make masks and distribute food. Sam spent some time at the food bank and came home to tell about a kid at the food bank named Dominic, who he guessed was about 14, who ran the whole show with remarkable authority and integrity. And if that doesn't give you hope for the future, I don't know what does. I am so heartened that during this dark night that people have expressed love for those they don't even know by staying home, wearing a mask when they go out, giving of their time, their talents, and their resources where they can. We are indeed meant to live in community, even when we're apart. And we are in this together. The third thing that I can count on, the third known in the storm of unknowns, is that our shepherd has proven his trustworthiness. The John 10 passage is all about trust. It starts with Jesus putting his reputation on the line. Twice he says, "Very truly I tell you, I am the gate." Americans aren't comfortable with the gate metaphor because we talk about gatekeeping in a very negative way, right? The gatekeepers are those that keep people out of exclusive groups, and the church definitely has a history of gatekeeping that's very negative. But I want to try to put this in an ancient Mediterranean frame again. What do gates do for a flock of sheep? It keeps them safe, certainly from predators and thieves, but it also gives access to pasture, to abundance. There is a time, according to our trustworthy shepherd, to be protected in the sheepfold and a time to be out in the pasture, enjoying abundance. And this is a comforting metaphor. Another thing that I loved about this passage was the role of the voice. The passage refers to hearing his voice or listening 4 times. The orality of the whole story is striking, It's just like what Christy just sang, right? I hear his voice. He'll call my name. And again, it takes me to the metaphor of the dark night. I can't see where I'm going in the dark, but I can still hear. In the dark, I trust the one who knows my name and whose voice I recognize. The dark night of the soul, like this time of social distancing, is a time of subtraction, not addition. A time of emptying, not filling. Relinquishment, not accumulation. But like Mimi said, night or darkness brings special opportunities, right? It's an opportunity to make shadow plays. Or it's a time that's very frightful, like Nate said, where you want to just climb into bed with mom and dad. But the best thing about the dark night is that while we feel stuck or defeated, as we may during this time of lockdown, God is active. The author Gerald May says that God's grace flows through the ruins of our failed attempts, softens our willfulness, and takes us where we could not go on our own. May also asserts that the dark night is dark for our protection. That's such an interesting notion. He says it's such a radically transformative growth process that if we saw where we were going and what we would be going through, we wouldn't do it. But because we are forced to move by faith, reaching out to the hand of the one next to us for security, forced to listen to the voice of the shepherd for direction, it keeps us safe. The divine is calling out to us in the dark, even though we can't see the divine at this moment. So let's listen. And that's the good news of the gospel.